factions, completely ineffective as the autonomous labor movement. Same is true for the women's movement. The parties completely hoard access to the state. They even dominate the media through corporate interests now. The parties themselves have no internal democracy, so there's none of the sort of branch stuff or provincial stuff you get in the ANC. It's all very top-heavy. I mean, Rahul Gandhi is still running the Congress Party. Are you kidding me? He's the worst politician in the world, and the only reason he's there is because his name is Gandhi, right? And this is supposed to be the secular opposition to the BJP. And the deal is really rent-sharing among the political parties. And you see this in urban land politics. The parties complain about everything, they protest about everything, they mobilize on everything. It is the most vibrant democracy in the world, there's absolutely no doubt about it. The only thing that the parties never get upset about is land dealing. And because land dealing is the #1 source of rents in every city, and they're thickly involved in land dealing, and they literally share the rents among themselves. South Africa, I'm almost tempted to skip South Africa because Carl already said everything that needs to be said. But I do want to bring the local government stuff. And obviously the legacy of apartheid is a legacy of extraordinarily autocratic forms of rule at the level of the city. The enforcement of apartheid policies, the segregated city. On the other hand, there were opportunities there, right? I mean, apartheid was this incredibly repressive, highly monitored, high surveillance system, which required a lot of state capacity. And the ANC took over the state capacity. And by Indian or even Brazilian standards, municipalities in South Africa are actually quite well resourced. They have their own resource base, quite competent local bureaucracies, etc. Constitutional reforms obviously established them as a third sphere of governance. They had a very organized civil society to work with, including the civics, which would have been perfect partners in a kind of sort of co-produced process of urban transformation. But very early on, after say 96, the civics, all the participatory structures get dismantled. The ANC is a dominant political party. It's quite top-down, quite Leninist. It becomes quite hostile to the idea of an independent civil society. And the mode of delivery, especially under Mbeki, becomes technocratic delivery, new public management, a kind of managerialist view, and participation is completely cut out of the equation. And so, to summarize this is obviously an equation where the balance is very much in favor of the political party, a dominant party that's very organized, but as Carl has argued, incredibly factionalized internally, and increasingly the problem of state capture is this kind of cannibalization of bureaucratic power, right? So some parts of the state are being cannibalized, others not so much, and we need a lot more research. Brazil, I want to be an optimist, so I'm going to finish on an optimistic note, but with the qualification before 2016, which is when Dilma Rousseff is ousted from power in a kind of constitutional coup, and I won't get into it, but that's the end of the PT period in power. And that period actually goes back to the 89 Constitution. The 89 Constitution, I think, is absolutely critical to understanding everything that transpired in Brazil in these last 3 decades. One of the things it did is it really enhanced the state capacity of municipalities. It devolved tremendous resources and responsibilities to municipalities. And it also instituted, as constitutional measures, a wide range of participatory practices, which looked a lot like the South African Constitution. The difference is civil society was not demobilized. On the contrary, because civil society was deeply suspicious of all political parties, even the PT, which really doesn't come to power until much later. Civil society took advantage of these new participatory structures, and especially in the more organized cities, the Sao Paulos, the cities in the south, to a lesser extent in the northeast, it's highly varied, but these new participatory structures, whether it's participatory budgeting or council democracies, these are civil society sectoral councils that actually have a lot of say over how federal resources are being allocated in health, education, transport, etc. And then the city statute, which is a law that is introduced in 2001, which mandates participation in the development of city plans. So you have all this sort of vibrant activity, and the sum result of this is to embed the local state. So the local state is now deeply embedded in civil society. And the best example of this is the healthcare reforms in Brazil. You know, Brazil did in 10 years what the United States of America has still been unable to do, right? Introduce universal primary health care. And infant mortality figures are way down. All the numbers are there to show that this has been largely successful. And the key was the sanitaristas, which is a movement of doctors and nurses that favored a right to public health care. And there's great research on this now. They've penetrated the local health ministries, right? So at the municipal level, they're running the health programs, and it's because of their linkages to actors in the favelas, et cetera, that they've been successful in expanding the healthcare system. So, you know, just to summarize, this was a setting and a set of reforms that made citizenship more effective, more high density. There's a break with, not a complete break with clientelism, but a rupture with clientelism, and all sorts of new forms of co-production. So whether it's labor reforms, whether it's urban renewal reforms, whether it's reforms in the education or the healthcare system, you have local states working with these mobilized civil society actors. And you know, the sum total of this is a quite synergistic product. And I'll give you a quick illustration of that in a moment.
None.
None. Okay, I am almost done. So the last point, this is a kind of unique constellation, and it's the balance of civil and political society I'm talking about is actually captured in the relationship between the PT and social movements. And unlike the ANC, the movements never compromise their autonomy. Towards the end, maybe a little bit more. Lula's been in power for a long time, but they didn't demobilize the way Sanko did. They didn't get captured through corporatist arrangements the way Crissalti did. They remain quite supportive of the PT, but autonomous from. And that gives you that kind of dynamic interaction between civil and political society that has these more synergistic effects. And I'm over my time, so I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
We're looking at is the rise of the new party management and the bureaucratic reform in South Africa. The first thing to mention here is that I'm going to deal with those 5 topics, and time allowing, I'm going to look at beyond new party management. Firstly, the colonial and the apartheid state were steeped in the Weberian dogma. Everything was done by the state. There was no market really to play any role in the delivery of services. Those are the characteristics on the screen. It was bureaucratic, law-driven, hierarchical, multi-layered, departmentally fragmented. This is as it applies to South Africa. Inward-oriented and racial oligarchy. This became more pronounced during the apartheid era, and that accounts for the brutality of the system, because the Weberian bureaucracy is law-driven. Officials did not take personal accountability for their actions. They were only executing superior orders or orders from their superiors. So there was no real accountability when it comes to things they did. In the result, the apartheid era was unaccountable. The new party management reform wave came about in the late 1970s. It started in the Anglo-Saxon countries, in the UK in 1979 during the prime ministerial term of Margaret Thatcher, and then in the US in 1980 during the presidential term of Ronald Reagan. It then spread to other countries, New Zealand, Australia, later Canada, and then it spread into the OECD countries. And I argue here that the receptiveness of those countries was as a result of their common law tradition, where there is no real divide between public and private, or the private sector and a public sector. So there's no divide there. So they were quite receptive to the NPM ideology or reform wave, which, as we're going to see later on, proposes or advocates for neoliberal ideas, neoliberal vision of the state. So in a sense, when it was introduced in the late 1970s, it was a reaction to the rule-bound nature or rigid nature of the Weberian bureaucracy. it was said that the Weberian bureaucracy is unresponsive and anachronistic. So this idea was presented as a administration for all seasons, this new public management. In South Africa, it came about during the dying days of apartheid. I argue here that when the writing was on the wall for the demise of the apartheid government kind of used this wave that was dominant in the north as an opportunity to loot state resources. They saw that apartheid is coming to an end. They cannot stand against the liberation movements on the electoral power, so they thought they could use these ideas to take state resources, in a sense, denuded state assets in preparation for life out of office. So in a sense, they wanted to retain the status quo ante of white ownership of the economy after the state, out of office. However, the government of national unity kind of saw through this and halted this rapid this rapid adoption of the new public management, and it pushed instead for nationalization. And as you all know, that during the negotiation period, the ANC kind of pushed for nationalization of all strategic sectors of the economy, in line with its policies, chief of which is the Freedom Charter. However, this idea was reintroduced now in three ways. In fact, in two ways after democratization. The first was willing adoption because the ANC government, or the government of national unity, thought that keeping the Weberian system would kind of perpetuate the exclusion. Remember, it was exclusionary. It insisted on qualifications. So the majority of the population was excluded from institutions that could qualify them. So keeping this would be exclusionary and would perpetuate apartheid. So they used it as an alternative to apartheid. It was also forced adoption in the sense that the letter of intent they had to sign when they got the IMF loan had some conditionalities which kind of forced them to adopt the new public management. And I say the third way South Africa adopted this is as an escape route during the apartheid era, which was halted but not reversed by the government of national unity. To cement the adoption of the new public management, there were two watershed conferences in South Africa, one in Magaliesburg, here in Gauteng, in 1991, and the other one was in Stellenbosch, in Montflair. The Mount Grace conference represented the first assault on the apartheid Weberian style of governance and championed instead the new public management. Montflair instead warned against the new government adopting populist policies, and it also suggested the new public management. It used, as I mentioned in the paper I wrote, apocalyptic language and used a kind of scenarios. The flight of the flamingos is the scenario that had to be adopted. And it used another scenario which was Icarius, meaning this new government would want to do things quickly, and then a quick boom, and then they would fall soon thereafter. So much that the new minister of finance, Tito Mboweni, who then was the chairperson of the economic affairs portfolio of the ANC, was heard in the fringes of that conference, the Montflair conference, saying that his movement is not going to adopt those Icarius now and crash later policies. So they were quite convinced by these two conferences to adopt the new public management. I also mentioned the letter of intent, which they signed as a commitment to adopt these neoliberal ideas and policies. The RDP, which I say was the watered-down version of the Freedom Charter, even though it still had these populist ideas around nationalization, was kind of leaning towards incorporating this idea of the new PARI management, because it spoke of the developmental state in a mixed economy where the private sector will be given a room to thrive. The white paper, RDP white paper, kind of abandoned all those ideas of the Freedom Charter that were contained in the RDP and went straight to neoliberalism. And that was followed by all these other policies listed on the screen. The white paper on the transformation of the public service of 1995, GEAR, as we all know, kind of shifted the state towards these neoliberal policies. The Presidential Review Commission, but Billy White Paper, all these contain various elements of the new public management. And all of them represented a shift from the RDP, which still wanted a dominant role of the state, a leading role of the state, but they all move now to the neoliberal policies of the new public management. Let me now look at the implementation, how it was implemented in South Africa. There were two ways in which it was implemented. I'm now picking a few elements of the new public management which are contained in those policy documents. Those elements are broken up into two. The first is the personal issues, and then I'll deal with the service delivery issues on the next slide. When it comes to the personnel issues, one element of the new public management is the managerialism, which means that you are letting managers manage, you are giving them the power, the managerial autonomy. The Public Service Act of 1997 kind of did create the SMS system, as we know it at national and provincial level. At a local level, we have, they are called Section 57 managers, the MM and the managers reporting to the municipal manager. Those managers are given all the autonomy to run the affairs of their departments. Unlike in the past, they don't wait for a superior order. They must act instantly, unlike in the Viparent past. So that element speaks to that. The second element is performance management. Remember, we said in the past, officials were only, did not account for their actions. They were only, executing superior orders. Now, in terms of the new public management, their autonomy had to be tied with accountability for performance. They had to sign performance agreements and performance targets. There was also an idea of contractualism, meaning there were short-term contracts introduced in terms of this element, of this model. Now they had to, instead of the job for life, that was the modus operandi in the past, now they have to, their tenure is kind of limited into 5 years. I think it was at some stage 2 years when it comes to the SMS service. And I think it is 5 years now. This also kind of served a transformation imperative in the sense that it creates a revolving door policy where the old guard are going to come out as the new minister comes in, and then he brings in his own people into the service. So there was a move away from the tenured system or job for life to a short-term form of contracts. The second leg is service delivery. Here we speak about corporatization and public-private partnerships. This speaks to the creation of semi-autonomous agencies or public entities as we know them today, which are at the arm's length from government. The idea here is that the department is going to run with the policy formulation, but the implementation of that policy is left to the agency or the state-owned entity or public entity. So they are at arm's length, but they are still part of government, but they are running they are run in terms of the private sector, techniques and management techniques. An example I make on the screen is the introduction of SANRAL in 1998 in terms of the SANRAL Act, which was meant to finance, manage, control, plan, develop, maintain, and rehabilitate the national road network in South Africa. The other element is the private partnerships. Here we talk about a commercial transaction, meaning a contract between the state and a private party, where the private party would perform the functions that were previously performed by the state, and then it would bear some risks, financial, technical, and professional, in connection with the performance of that function. And then it would receive benefit. As you can see, unlike the Verbarian system, the new public management means that the functions that were performed by the state previously are now performed by the private sector in various ways, as you saw. I make that example of the PPP water project. There were 4 provincial contracts given to the private sector. However, in this instance, this happened in the late 90s, and there was no regulatory framework at that stage. So it was a case of private sector, government took the risk in this instance, not the private sector. So it was not managed properly. Even though it did manage to do some work. For example, as I'm doing the assessment on the next slide, I'm going to indicate that we managed to meet, as far as at the local level is concerned, the Millennium Development Goals because of those contracts, even though government had to bear all the risks. So the assessment of these, for example, when it comes to managerialism, the senior management corps, both at national, provincial, and then at local level, that is created and it is working quite well. Those managers are not waiting for superior orders. They are discharging functions efficiently. However, what has turned out is that the majority of them are beholden to politicians. This speaks to the third point about contractualism and maybe the performance management system. They are beholden in the sense that they are on short-term contract. So their tenure in the public service is very long, and that is a fatal ground for corruption. And I'm going to explain it later on. The performance management system overall performance improved. However, it is not always, these are not always signed. And if they are signed, they're not always enforced. If they are not signed, this then compromises the whole performance management system, in the sense that it's supposed to cascade down. The senior manager signs first, and then it goes down like that. So if he doesn't sign, then he can't hold the managers down under him, according to the performance management system. So I'm saying here, they are sometimes poorly formulated or enforced in an arbitrary way, depending on the relationship of the senior manager with the executive authority or the minister. So relationships counts a lot in this instance. Then there's this last element around contractualism, which in a sense was meant to keep the managers on their toes, because you have only 5 years to perform. If you don't perform, you don't renew your contract. It was meant to make sure that they operate business-like. But it has led to a lot of problems when it comes to the public sector, brain drain being one of them, high rate of turnover. There was uncertainty with bred anxiety. Managers would come in, and then on year 1, on year 3, they are thinking of life out of office, because they know their contract will come to an end. If they did not please, for example, the executive authority, they will be seriously worried, and that, like I'm saying, creates a fertile ground for corruption. It also impacts on organizational stability, in the sense that you chop and change managers every 5 years, so there's no stability there. When it comes to corporatization, there are some exceptional cases, cases of excellence. For example, Sandra. Sandra has been doing very well, despite, notwithstanding the recent uproar regarding the e-tolls and all those things. But generally, Sandra has been doing quite well. But generally, others are not doing well. There is a collapse of corporate governance. This was revealed in many of the public prosecutor reports around state-owned enterprises. There's also a dysfunctional working relationship between boards and shareholders. I make an example here of Armsco. They are prone to corruption. I make an example of PRASA. They lead to political appointment of cronies. You know the story around SAA. I won't mention names here, and Denel. So the new parliament, in a sense, is fertile ground for state capture. The public-private partnerships, especially as it relates to the water sector, the example I made, millions of households gained improved access to water, even met the Millennium Development Goals on water. As a result of this, however, there are those problems. You'll remember they operate on the private sector principles. The cost-reflective pricing and cost recovery policies do not work well in the private sector, in a sense. They have resulted in a sharp increase in water prices, resulting in poor households losing access to water. There are numerous cases of disconnections here. And as I indicated earlier, the private sector did not bear the risk. So the government bore all the risk because there was no regulatory framework when these were started.
30 seconds.
10 seconds.
30.
Just briefly on looking beyond the new power management. What is clear is that it was not, as it was touted, management for all seasons. It had some adverse outcomes, especially when it comes to South Africa. I'm not sure how it operated elsewhere. It created a close link between government and the private sector, and that is fertile ground for corruption. And that's maybe how some of the state capture came in. Previously, government would deliver all the services itself. Now it has to rely on the private sector. There's this close linkages between the state and the private sector. And Zach said, as Zach said this morning, that corruption takes two. You can't corrupt yourself. And the corruptor usually is the private sector, corrupting government officials. State must build this capacity, this is my recommendation, and deliver services instead of relying. So in a sense, I'm saying we must move away from this new public management idea, and state must develop its own capacity and deliver services so that there is that divide between the public and then the private. And that would maybe I should not mention other recommendations, except to say that the precarious tenure of senior managers maybe is also causing this problem because it leads them to be corrupt. They have only 5 years in the public service, and then they are susceptible to tag and pull of rent seekers because they would need to leave after 5 years. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Okay, let's open up right away for discussion. I'll take questions and comments in rounds of 3. We probably have time for 2 rounds of 3 questions and comments.
Let me take it on my. Is it yours? Yeah. Thanks.
Joe, thank you.
My question is to Fendile. You did threaten that you were going to go through your presentation without mentioning state capture. I take a number of the points you made about new public management. I'm not an advocate of anyone, but it seems to me that you have used your preference for state-run services to crucify new public management on the altar of state capture. Am I being unfair?
Okay, thank you. Lucas? Yeah.
This question for Patrick. I have a question regarding Brazil and then another more general. The one about Brazil is if you can develop, I think you lack time just developing the ideas of a more autonomous civil society and and the break with clientelism? Because these are claims the PT side of the political spectrum would do, but they are quite challenged from the other side. So I would like you to please develop a little bit more which sector of civil society you see as more autonomous, not linked to the state, and with the break of clientelism in which particular areas. And then more generally, which are the implications you raise out of this variation among cases in these two dimensions, stateless and participation? Would it be that up to 2016 Brazil is more democratic or deepen democracy further than the other cases? You can please look a little bit more the implications of the variations. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's take one more. Yes, ma'am.
This question is directed to you.
Yeah.
You make it quite clear that the NPM regime actually came with quite a lot of contradictions in it. But I'm not hearing you point out the way in which it had ripple effects of creating this poverty gap, especially in communities and local government, where you found that the NPM also came with reforms such as introducing technologies, for example, when it comes to water services, electricity services, where communities were actually now being forced to pay for these services using these technologies of cutting these services. So I'm not hearing you putting it very clear in terms of how it also contributed towards the framing of service delivery protests that really happened, especially in the 1990s. And then secondly, I would like you to just provide a clarity in terms of the kind of regime that we're now seeing ourselves in South Africa, particularly when it comes to this developmental state discourse. Where does the NPM fit in? Because we can see that the South African government now is looking at the state playing a much more participatory role in the development of South Africa. So how do these two reconcile for the further development of communities in particular?
Thank you. In fact, I'm going to ask Carl to also respond to your first question about, protest and the way in which, what Pindile was saying about new public management might have fed into, this cutting off services, etc., might have fed into protest. So Pindile, let's start with you. We'll come to Patrick and then Carl.
All right, let me just attempt the last one. Currently in South Africa, like you indicate, we are moving towards merging the two ideas because the state now is playing a leading role. I'll make an example of the local sector. That's the sector I'm comfortable with, local government. At that sector, we have laws emanating from the Treasury that seeks to place emphasis on qualifications, and those are Weberian, in a sense. New public management doesn't talk about qualifications. So it places emphasis on qualification, enforcement, ethics, and then it doesn't abandon the NPM ideas because we still talk about short-term contracts. At that level, we talk about performance management. So there is a blend, in a sense, currently, of these two operating together. But I would argue that they work against each other. You can't introduce qualifications on the one hand and then allow them to be flushed out through short-term contracts on the other hand. So they work against each other. You must make sure that you make longer-term contracts, if that's even possible, or contracts for life, so that you know that the people who get into the system stay there and do the job. Don't get them in and then flush them out through this revolving door phenomenon I was talking about of short-term contracts. So there are, in my sense, there are elements that can be taken from both sides, which can work together. We do need performance management. We can't allow a situation where officials do things and then they're not accountable for those things that they do. So you must hold them accountable. We do need to go back to the Weberian system where you had, they were employed for a longer time so that they can make impact. This thing of constant changes is not working for stability and institutional memory and all those things. So that's my point on the last question. On your first question, I did indicate that this introduced the PPPs, especially on the water sector, kind of assisted so much that we have reached the Millennium Development Goals there. But remember, we are talking now about private sector principles of cost recovery, and they don't work well. That is why, for example, they introduce those machines you're talking about of capping water or disconnecting, so much that they led to protests. Because you give people water and then you want them to pay, especially the poorest of the poor. If it was delivered by government, for example, I don't think government would use those kind of techniques, private sector techniques, demanding payment for water. I'm sure it was going to be done differently. That's why I'm saying it created these problems at that level. I'm not sure if I've addressed you sufficiently. To your question, the very first question. I did address it briefly when I was addressing her first question. My preference is the blend of the two, because there are elements that can be taken from new public management that can work and that are working still. But we can't take everything, because if you take everything, it works against what we are moving towards. The more developmental state where government plays a leading role, regulation and all those things.
Fair enough.
Patrick?
Okay, so Lucas, yes, the shift from clientelism, you're right. I didn't have time to fully work that through. But, and I know that's part of the discourse, but I think there's plenty of research to support it. So Bolsa Familia, which, on the one hand, this is a conditional cash transfer program, and the distributional pattern is clear. I mean, it's gone to areas where there's a lot of poor people, and so it's kind of a big patronage program, but for the urban poor and the rural poor. And what's interesting is Wendy Hunter and others have done work, and it's clear that the politicians got cut out of it. I mean, it's the federal government allocating the money. It goes directly to people's bank accounts, not unlike the child support grant and the old age grant in South Africa. And then it's municipalities that enforce the conditionalities. And in the survey work they've done, they report that recipients think of this as a right, not the traditional kind of assistance, I can't say it in Portuguese, but the conventions or patronage handout. And in general, Peter Hautziger's done work on how people engage the state, and then in a book that I did with Jean-Paul Bayoki, we did some work in 8 cities, and even the discourse of citizens have changed. They see themselves as citizens who have a right to certain things as opposed to supplicants or subjects. So, these things are hard to measure by definition, but it does strike me as a significant shift. And of course, it's going to vary across Brazilian cities. And then the implication on stateness. I mean, if we're talking about state reform, we're talking about institution building. And institution building is by definition a political process, right? So, on the one hand, you have the kind of World Bank or MPN discourse about good designs, and you bring a bunch of consultants in, and they have best practices, and it's all nonsense, because we all know that the organogram, what's the difference between an organization and an institution? An institution is an organization with norms, right? It's not just the organogram or the best practices. And those norms, especially in a democracy, are about embedding that institution in democratic practices. And especially when it comes to delivering complex things like informal settlement, rehabilitation, or integrating sanitation and water services, or delivering primary health care to the favelas, no state can deliver that alone. They need to co-produce that. And so they have to have these kind of synergistic relationships with civil society actors. And so I think, what's interesting is that the participatory reforms that were introduced in South Africa in 94, in India in 91, and in Brazil in 89 are almost identical in terms of the ideal of participatory democracy. The difference was the take-up from below. In South Africa, civil society was demobilized. In India, the frontline bureaucracy never even really tried and never had the authority to do anything. But in Brazil, they had the resources, they had the built-up state capacity, and they embedded themselves in civil society. And that's what made those institutions that much more robust.
Carl.
I'm afraid, Chair, I've got nothing to say about new public management and protests. So I'll have to pass on it.
All right, let's take another round then. We had a hand there. Zach, I thought you had a hand up. Yeah, okay. Yeah, let's go to the back there.
Supposedly we have to, get some case study or best practice elsewhere, outside of IPSA or outside of South Africa. What states or which states is really best run or best organized and getting by efficient? And perhaps we can also look at the West Asian
Zach?
I was very interested in class or elitism development. It was put up as almost like something inevitable. Once you had apartheid, and once you had 1994, that class development and elitism was inevitable almost. Almost one gets the impression that you couldn't stop it, things like that. I'm interested in two things. One is, what could have been done about it to make sure that those negative consequences didn't follow? And secondly, was there the same sort of class development as the African American people became more and more powerful in that sector? And was there the same kind of trouble in India or Brazil?
Carl, let's start with you. But before we do, I'd like to also slip in a question here, abusing my position for a moment. Pindile, I'm very interested in this blended model that you talk about and that we're moving towards in South Africa. And the question I'd like to ask is, thinking back over the last decade and the kind of hollowing out of state institutions, the way in which senior bureaucrats in many cases were hounded out as the Zupta project took hold. If we just think forward, there's a gentleman in this room who's been asking us over and over again through the day to think our way forward, to think about the kind of reforms we're talking about and what they might deliver in a decade or two or three. The kind of reforms that you are talking about that are beginning to emanate from National Treasury, would they be able to build a bureaucracy that is robust, sufficiently robust, to be able to withstand the kind of assault we've seen, especially I think in the last decade in South Africa, how do we think about those reforms when we think about rebuilding, I think, the capacity of the state going forward in South Africa? Carl, can we start with you?
Yes, sure. So that's a nice, pithy, but very tough question. I do think that elite formation was inevitable. I also think it's necessary. In fact, even today, and this is something I forgot to mention, so the press and conversation and so on is full of talk about the conspicuous consumption, about corruption and so on of the new elite. But it really has to be said that the new elite is, generally speaking, far less wealthy than the old white elite, which happens to be able to hide itself from public view and from the press. So it seems to be untenable to have a situation in a post-apartheid South Africa where a black elite doesn't have access to capital, is not able to come into being and actually challenge the domination of old white elites. So yes, I think it's inevitable. The question is the form that it takes. So I suppose I've got two thoughts on that. The one is that the state could have, would it have been possible for the state to take a more disciplinary approach to the formation of this elite? constraining the practices. So, I mean, to give you an example, in South Korea, I mean, the system was not so different under the military dictatorship. But there, and the project was to develop a domestic capitalist class that could compete with capitalists across the world. And it was done. State resources were allocated, rents were allocated, but there was a very clear quid pro quo. Capitalists had to deliver certain things, they had to deliver certain kinds of goods. And if they didn't, there was harsh punishment. And a military dictatorship was able to deliver that. Question is, is it possible to envisage a kind of transition where that would have been possible? The second, so that's one issue, it seems to me, is a kind of policing, a kind of morality that might have attended the formation of a new elite, a new capitalist class. But the second is really that, as I tried to argue, the only scope for the formation of this new of these new classes was through the state and through effectively breaking the law that governs the way the state operates. Now, I wonder if there hadn't been a more concerted redistributive effort, an attempt to redistribute wealth, in particularly ownership of assets, as a kind of forced march to the formation of a new elite, whether that could have prevented the kind of dysfunctional looting of the state. So, could one have nationalized white wealth, various forms of white wealth? Could one, for example, have nationalized 24% of the share, 25% of the share capital of all corporations on the stock exchange? Those kinds of things. Turn that into a fund for the formation of new capitalists. The problem for South Africa was that the new South Africa emerged at a time of globalization, when the developmental state was, effectively ruled impossible, out of order by global forces, by consultancies, by the way the global market operated. Now, again, could one have pushed that further? But I think that in South Africa, we had this misfortune to come into become independent, to come into our own at that particular moment where all the tools that were used by previous developmental states were rendered obsolete or not available. So thinking of India, for example, I mean, India formed a developmental state on independence, and there's a powerful globalized capitalist class that emerged on that terrain. So, that isn't the issue that confronts the state there, or the development of that society. The same goes for Tanzania and the Nyerere and various other kinds of states. The Afrikaners in South Africa constructed a developmental state at the same time as the Indian developmental state was being formed. And it's a different kind of project to do that at the moment of globalization, which is, when Mandela goes to Davos and comes back and says nationalization is off the table. Could the ANC have resisted that imperative? I don't know, but those are some of the areas that one would want to have explored to produce a different kind of elite formation.
Thank you. Patrick?
Yeah, I want to build on that point really quickly, just to try to make the case for why state capture seems to be so pervasive across so many different parts of the world, and not just the quote developing world, but even the US. And I do think, the key point is that elites no longer have a stake in national regulatory environments because they're not captive to that environment. They have so many exit options. They have so many possibilities for leveraging returns on their capital, that they can essentially engage in a kind of global institutional arbitrage, right? They seek the institutional environments where they have the highest returns. And so they can defect entirely from national environments. I mean, the South Korean bourgeoisie, at the time they were beginning to develop through infant industry protection, their what turned out to be extraordinary global competitive powers. At the time, the penalty for exporting capital was death. right? So that's a pretty strong message, right? Capital stays at home, we'll subsidize you, but in turn, you have to deliver on exports, etc. That's an accumulation project, right? That is not a rent-seeking project. Whereas today, elites are not that interested in accumulation as much as, you know, identifying rent-thick sectors, and they've got the entire sort of global economy to play with. And so I think, you know, my concern is that, unfortunately, I think that ship has sailed, because the only forces demanding a reversal of that process are the Trumpists, right? The projects of ethno-nationalist closure. The left is sort of at a loss here, and reversing some of those developments without global coordination is going to be incredibly difficult. But this does then put the onus on strengthening democratic institutions, right? And it's a huge onus. And it's not even clear it's feasible. I mean, Danny Roderick famously says it's not feasible. You know, you either do globalization or you do democracy. But again, I think the ship has sailed, so it's a tough one.
Can I make one? So I think I think Patrick is right. But then the problem is for an elite that is not yet in existence. You know, the machinery that you used to use was the national state.
Right.
And that's where this other kind of project comes in, which is it no longer has a national state that will forge the conditions for its emergence, and therefore the looting. Yeah.
Yes.
Pindula, you have the last word.
The first point to your question is that no, this plan that is emerging is not going to work because, like I said, it's contradictory in itself. It has elements that work against each other. So I, for example, still see a role for the NPM, some of its elements. For example, the PPPs. Given the scale of underdevelopment in the country, we still need to tap into the private sector resources to rectify the ravages of apartheid. That's the point I want to make around PPPs. We still need to use them. But we also need to use a few of that. For example, like I'm saying, performance management is very critical. We need to, managers can't just run aloof. They need to be held accountable to their actions. But we also need to insulate them. Because if we insist on the Weberian system of saying we must get qualified people, then we must ensure that we insulate them. If we get professionally to the public service, we must not interfere constantly. We must let them be. They must be insulated from political meddling or interference. So what I'm proposing, for example, for this bureaucracy that is sufficiently robust would be a nice blend of these elements, those that can stand together. For example, let me just quickly mention them. We do still need the strong managers. We need qualified managers. We need performance management system. And we do need the PPPs. So that's in the new PARI management. But then we do need the whole of Weber, the Weberian state, which will run with everything. Yeah.
Thank you. I think with that, we can bring this panel to a close. Thank you very much. Please join me in thanking the panelists. So at 6 o'clock, we have Conrad Koch and Chester missing. I'm told he'll be downstairs. So we've got a half an hour break. Thank you.
And cocktails.
And cocktails, indeed, of course. It's important. Yes, down.
Right, yeah, please. I was wondering about
Let's stretch your legs. I've been sitting all day.